Afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Scott Mosenthal. I recently became the president of this organization. I would be remiss if I didn't thank those who have helped me along here, particularly Veronica Gedrich, who's been obviously the president for a number of years, Pat Ryan before her. Those two have been instrumental in, how shall we say, gently persuading me to take on this position, but happy to do so. And just a wonderful group of people. And we're here because you're here. So we're really like to thank you for joining us today for this particular presentation, and hopefully in the future. We appreciate the volunteers and the financial support of members, the Village of Irvington. Special shout out to David Imamura, our county legislator, who has been very helpful in a number of ways, and as well as our New York State representatives. The presentation is going to be roughly 45 minutes or so. We will follow that with questions and answers. You may use the chat button at any time to pose questions. You're not going to see those questions, but the panelists will see them. And at the end, we'll be the ones to throw the questions back out to the audience. I'd like to tell you also in advance, there will be a little quiz. I shouldn't call it a quiz, it's a contest at the end. And that'll be when Samantha is finished. Typically there's the call for donations and whatnot, and I will do that. But prior to that request, I will give you a question based on Irvington history. And then please, on the chat button, send in your answers. Board members, you can participate, but you cannot win. But you feel good if you have the right answer. The first one wins, who gets it right. And there will be a special award for that, which I will announce later if you're the first one. So you can look forward to that at the end. But it means you got to stay on to the end to find out. This is not for the folks that are going to look at this later in the week. So please remember that this presentation is protected by copyright. And now I'd like to bring on Sarah Kelsey, who is chair of the Society's programming. She is going to introduce Samantha to you. Sarah?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that the snow is not making you crazy in your homes. Today, we're very lucky to have Samantha Wilcoxson with us to give this presentation. She's the author of James Alexander Hamilton, Son of the American Revolution. Through his life and times, she traces the transformative century from the Constitutional Convention through the Civil War. Samantha herself is a prolific author of historical, both fiction and nonfiction. Her work blends meticulous research with deeply human storytelling. And I read this book and I can vouch for it. We look forward, Samantha, to hearing from you today on a topic that is still very relevant today. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Let me get my screen shared here. All right, are you seeing that now, hopefully?
You're good to go. No.
All right, thank you. So yeah, before I even start, I just want to talk about this portrait here of James Alexander Hamilton. This portrait you might not have seen before unless you have a copy of my book, or if you've heard me speak before. It's not generally available. And how I ended up with a picture of James's portrait is because during research for my book, I was put in touch with one of James's descendants who actually owns this portrait. So Helen Hamilton Spalding not only shared the image with me, but gave me permission to use it in my work, and it was used in the design of my book cover, which I'm especially excited about. So I like to start out with sending a thank you out to Helen Hamilton Spalding for this image, because if you've ever tried to find pictures of James, you probably have found the same thing I did, that there is one picture of him you can find in some things online, and that's really about it. So I was over the moon to find this one. So anyway, there's James, who we will talk about today. And he was born the same year the Constitution was ratified in 1788. The era of U.S. history from this event through the Civil War is often overlooked, despite it being a time of tremendous importance. The founders, like James's father, had set the stage for this new country. They had won independence, which of course was a huge step, and through the Constitutional Convention had managed to unify these 13 very different states. But now it was up to their heirs to determine how that was going to work and what it was actually going to look like. How would a country like this operate? Lots of really big, important questions that they had to answer. And James served as a keen observer of this era. He kept lots of documentation about his views of events and his correspondence regarding national affairs with statesmen of the day like John Quincy Adams and Martin Van Buren, and many others who aren't as familiar to modern ears, but were vital contributors to the early growth and development of the U.S. government. People like Hamilton Fish and Lewis Cass. If you're from Michigan, like I am, you've probably heard a lot of places named after Cass that include, Cassopolis, Cass County, things like that, but maybe didn't even realize that that is who those things are named after. James provides unique insight into the nation's first century through the Civil War. During that time, he advised President Lincoln. His lifetime stretched an impressive 90 years and saw an incredible amount of change from those 13 original states to 38 when Colorado joined the Union just a month before James's death. And of course, this era not only includes a bloody civil war, but everything that led up to that and the evolution in mindset that made half the country willing to fight to outlaw slavery. We'll look at these turbulent decades with James as our key witness. And besides his personal letters and papers, James compiled a book in 1869 titled Reminiscences of James A. Hamilton, or Men and Events at Home and Abroad During 3/4 of a Century, which is a beautiful 19th century title, but I will be referring to it simply as Reminiscences. So if I say that, I will be saying that that's the book I'm referring to. And that was actually what led me to write this biography, was finding that book. And I just wanted to make James's witness of history more accessible to the modern reader. So, like I said, James was born April 14th, 1788, 2 months before the ratification of the Constitution. His father, of course, had participated in the Constitutional Convention as a representative from New York, and you can see Alexander Hamilton kind of right in the front and center of this famous painting of the Constitutional Convention, which had gone on for several months the year before. James would also live in New York his entire life. He spent a lot of time in Washington for different reasons, but New York was always where he called home, including serving at one point as the district attorney of Southern New York. In his reminiscences, he records happy memories of both of his parents. Not a lot of personal information in general, but he does make sure to include some positive things about both of his parents. His parents had attended the inaugural ball of George Washington, who of course is also in this portrait. That happened the year following James's birth. And James would later retain valuable gifts that his parents had received from the Washingtons, including a Gilbert Stuart portrait and a silver tankard. James recalled family life at Hamilton Grange, the only home ever owned by Alexander Hamilton, where Alexander had planted 13 gum trees to honor those 13 original states. Those trees unfortunately did not survive, and Hamilton Grange is not in its original location any longer either, though it is part of a state park in Harlem. So if you haven't visited, probably a lot of locals have, but if you haven't, I definitely highly recommend that. Alexander would commute into the city, James wrote, each day riding a two-wheeled cart so that he could be home in the evenings to spend time with his family. And Eliza, James's mother, he writes also about her being devoted and that she would refer to James as her husband's favorite child. And of course, Eliza never lost her passion for defending Alexander's legacy, even decades after his death. And this is something that she definitely passed on to James as well. Alexander Hamilton was serving as regent and trustee of Columbia University during part of the time that James and his older brothers attended. While a student there, James received a thesis on discretion from his father with a note saying, "You may need it," which I think are ironic words coming from the writer of the Reynolds pamphlet, which is something that James did not mention in his reminiscences. He also didn't write about the death of his older brother, Philip, in his reminiscences. He had been killed in a duel with George Eaker just 3 years before their father was killed in eerily similar circumstances in a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr. This tragic loss was really a defining moment in the Hamilton family. Obviously, they lost a husband, a father, a breadwinner, and a man who was very well known at the time. So it was a public tragedy that happened when James was 16 years old. James, like I said, never stopped defending his father's legacy. He was very well known for collecting testimony regarding his father's service to the country long after Alexander's death. James graduated from Columbia in 1805, and he went on to practice law just like his father. As James was beginning a career in law, Lewis and Clark were setting off on their Western exploration to document the recently obtained Louisiana Purchase. And James, being a lawyer, was likely participating in debates over the constitutionality of that purchase. Because though we take it for granted now, the Louisiana Purchase, it was kind of controversial at the time, and many people didn't think that the president had the power to make that kind of decision. So just kind of a fun note on that. All right, so James began practicing law, and I'm just going to pause for a second just to talk about these images. The one on the left is the one I was talking about of James, that if you search for him online, this is probably the picture that pops up. It's taken from a miniature that was done when James was about 48 years old. And the other picture here is the companion portrait to that first one I showed you. This is his wife, Mary Morris. And so this one, this portrait also is held by Helen Hamilton Spaulding. And so again, thank you to her for sending the picture of it to me and allowing me to use that. So when James began practicing law, he became friends with other young men practicing law, like Washington Irving, who really hated being an attorney and decided to devote himself to writing instead. And Martin Van Buren, who went on to redefine the role of the American politician in a way that probably would have horrified George Washington. James was only 22 when he married Mary Morris, and that was on October 17th, 1810. So little fun fact for me is that anniversary is shared with my youngest son and his wife. So I love little coincidences like that. James wrote that he felt driven towards success by the poor financial situation that he and Mary found themselves in, due to the inability of their parents to really assist them in any way. If you have read about the Hamiltons, you've probably heard about the pact that was put together when Alexander Hamilton was killed. So several of his friends came together and donated money to enable James's mother to keep the family home, Hamilton Grange, because otherwise she wasn't going to be able to afford it because of the amount of debt Alexander had left her in. So when James was married at that young age of 22, he also was in not great financial, didn't have financial wealth, but his father's name was a great asset to him. Almost exactly a year after their wedding, James and Mary welcomed their first child. It was a daughter, and they named her Elizabeth. So she would go on to marry George Lee Schuyler, making her Elizabeth Hamilton Schuyler, not to be confused with her grandmother, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. Just to mention here the rest of James and Mary's children, I have only been able to find images of 3 of them. So that's what we have here. And the other 2 are just listed at the top. So Elizabeth, the oldest, she's listed up there. The Hamiltons went on to have 5 children in 9 years. And they bought a home in at 64 Varick Street in what we would now call Lower Manhattan. Their second daughter, Frances, she is the one who would bear children through whom James has descendants today. Those are through her. And their third child, an only son in the middle here, was, of course, named Alexander Hamilton. As you might imagine, that was a very popular name to give baby boys in the Hamilton family, which can get a little confusing when you are trying to look into their family history. James had a brother named Alexander, and then also his son here, and a nephew who's almost the exact same age as his son, all named Alexander Hamilton, and all who at one point wrote their name as Alexander Hamilton II. So sometimes it's difficult to know which one is being referred to when you look back at documents. This Alexander Hamilton served as the president of the Astor Library, that is now the main branch of the New York Public Library. And that's actually where this portrait hangs. That's where I took this picture of him, is in that library. And you can see his bust of his grandfather, Alexander Hamilton, in that picture as well. Their next daughter, or next child, another daughter, that's the other image here, is Mary, named after her mother. And she would go on to become the first New York regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So she did her part to restore Mount Vernon. They had to raise the money to purchase it, to restore it, and to carry on the Washington name there. She did her part there. And then finally, they have one more daughter who I don't have an image of. Her name's just up here at the top, Angelica Hamilton, named for James's sister, who was of rather delicate health, especially after the deaths of their brother and father. This Angelica would travel to Europe with her father and not marry until later in life. Together, they formed a loving, tight-knit family, which is demonstrated through their family correspondence and also just through the amount of time they clearly spent together and how much these children of James and Mary remained at the family estate even after marriage and adulthood. All right, getting back to statesmanship. In 1829, just to comment on this picture, this is a painting of Washington, D.C. in right around 1829, when the year that James served as temporary Secretary of State. So looking a little bit different than it does today. So this year, which was 2 years after New York abolished slavery within the state, James had a unique opportunity to serve President Andrew Jackson. And this is the president whose name James is most frequently associated with because of this time. James had represented the state of New York in honoring Jackson in New Orleans shortly before his presidency. And that time, and James's friendship at that time with Martin Van Buren, made James a natural choice to serve as temporary secretary until Van Buren could wrap up his duties and get to Washington himself. So James observed that he thought this election of Jackson was a course change in U.S. history, which you might find interesting because if you know anything about election history around this time, we tend to talk about the election of 1824 as being the really standout odd one. And it was because it's the only election that's ever been decided by the House of Representatives when no candidate got enough electoral votes to win the presidency. So that one was the winner, declared winner, was John Quincy Adams. And at that time, Jackson thought that he had been robbed of a victory that he had earned because he had the greater popular vote, even though it wasn't enough electoral votes. What James thought was more interesting about the election of 1828 was that Jackson wasn't a statesman. And James wrote that instead of electing what he called only the wisest men of the country of all parties, that Jackson was elected for popularity. He had been a successful soldier. And James thought that he was, quote, wholly uneducated and without talent, so far as statesmanship went. Though he did say that his intentions were upright and his integrity unquestionable. James was modest about his own appointment, writing, I have this day received from the general a letter appointing me acting Secretary of State. Thus, I will at least have the gratification of being connected with the history of our government and have had some slight influence on its affairs. John Quincy Adams also wrote about James's appointment in his famously detailed diary. And he believed that James would be named an Undersecretary of State because he knew how much Jackson enjoyed having him there in Washington. I have not, unfortunately, been able to discover why that appointment wasn't made, but even though James's official time as Secretary of State was short, he did become a regular advisor to Jackson throughout his presidency. Not that Jackson always took James's advice. If you've heard anything about James and his connection with Jackson, he often is referred to as a Jacksonian, and there will be accusations that he did not support the national bank that his father had created. And that wasn't the case. They corresponded frequently regarding Jackson's desire to eliminate the national bank. And James was actually prepared to defend it fiercely. Technically, it wasn't Hamilton's bank. That charter had been allowed to expire under President James Madison, but the War of 1812 changed Madison's mind about the country's need for a central bank to regulate the U.S. banknotes and stabilize the economy. The second Bank of the United States was under scrutiny by Jackson, who was convinced that it was an unconstitutional tool of the rich. James provided copious evidence of the bank's positive impact on the U.S. and global economy, to the extent that in one letter he admitted, I do not mean to extend this letter to be a dissertation upon banking, before going on to write pages and pages and pages of banking. He offered testimonials of respected bankers, statistics, and suggestions on reforms that he hoped would appease Jackson. But the president was determined, and even as they disagreed over bank issues, Jackson consistently requested James' presence in Washington, pulling him away from his position as district attorney of Southern New York enough that James ended up resigning that position. James was tasked with things like editing Jackson's annual address to Congress and other correspondence. He made great efforts on the bank issue to enlighten the president, but he wrote these efforts were wholly unavailing. He had determined before he came to Washington to destroy the Bank of the United States and the result was a most disastrous inflation of the currency, reckless speculation, and the extended ruin of 1837. Another issue occurring around the same time was the nullification crisis. An ordinance of nullification was passed by the South Carolina legislature under the leadership of John C. Calhoun, who believed that no state was under an obligation to follow a federal law that didn't benefit that state. Therefore, tariffs, in the case of South Carolina, could be nullified within that state. Jackson spoke boldly against this action. Jackson spoke boldly on most things, if you know anything about him. Even as South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union over this issue. So we tend to think of secession as a Civil War issue, but it had actually been threatened more than once by several states as the U.S. evolved and it was determined what power should lay with the state and which should belong to the federal government. This is actually one of the many issues that James went in search of testimony about his father regarding, because rumors reached him that Alexander had been involved in a group of New England states that threatened to secede from the Union over Jefferson's embargo, which was not beneficial to those states at that time. And it was John Quincy Adams who James went to get reassurance that Alexander had been discouraging those states from seceding, which of course is what James would have expected from his father. And at this time in the 1830s, Jackson also kept South Carolina in the Union, but obviously it was not the last time secession would be threatened by the southern states. In the meantime, James was building Nevis, his family estate on the Hudson River. Eliza Hamilton had recently sold Hamilton Grange, it having just become too much for her to maintain. So when James purchased the property, now Columbia University's Nevis Laboratories, it was a meadow containing a single tree. His friend and neighbor, Washington Irving, who built his Sunnyside the same year, suggested that James call the estate Single Tree Hall. But James chose Nevis in honor of the small Caribbean island where his father had been born. And just a quick note on pronunciation, if you have traveled to the Caribbean and gone to the island, you'll know that natives there pronounce it Nevis. And if you've been to Columbia University, you know that they pronounce it Nevis. So assuming that James would have pronounced it at Nevis, as his father probably did. I don't know exactly where that evolution in pronunciation happened, but just so you know, if you go to the Caribbean island, they will pronounce it Nevis. So Nevis, we'll call it, was built the same year that James's daughter, Elizabeth, married George Lee Schuyler. So James signed over a portion of land where they built a cottage on the waterfront there on the Hudson. James was very close to them both, writing them many letters when he would travel to Europe, sharing lots of observations about what he saw and people he met with his daughter, and writing to George Lee Schuyler about business and him managing his finances while he was away.
Samantha, can I just pause you for a second, please?
Yeah.
Okay, this is a good time. If you do have questions, thinking ahead when Samantha finishes in a while, if you want to start asking your questions now would be a good time to do that. And the chat is open for anybody who'd like to do so. Sorry for the interruption. All yours.
All right, thank you. No problem. James's nephew, another Alexander Hamilton, of course, reflected that Nevis had beautiful views of the noble Hudson up and down the river, and that it was always a bright and happy home. When James's youngest daughter, Angelica, was married in 1860, she too was gifted a 9-acre plot and built a cottage there so that the family could always easily spend time together. Other changes to the property included the building of the Hudson River Railroad in 1848. For this public use of James's waterfront property, he was compensated $2,450. We can only assume that he believed the convenience of the rail line was worth the sound of trains going by and the marring of his waterfront view. The Croton Aqueduct was also built between 1837 and 1842 to supply New York City with fresh water. And this also was built across the properties, not only James's and Washington Irving's, but many other people to go the length that goes. It ended at a reservoir that stood where the main branch of the New York Public Library stands today, that library where his son would serve as president, and that it's also that library that today holds the largest collection of James A. Hamilton papers. And that is where I got to hold a letter in my hands to James written by John Quincy Adams, one of the most exciting moments. James lived at Nevis until his death in 1878. The property was inherited by his son, and it was him, James's son Alexander, who added the wings to the house. There are two in this picture. One of them is kind of behind that tree, and he's the one who added the brick and the Doric columns to the house too, to make it appear as it does today. Upon James's first trip to Europe in 1836, he was offered letters of introduction by President Jackson, but James wrote, "I didn't use it. My father's name was my best passport to society." Though he was 48 years old, proving that mothers always worry about their children, Eliza wrote, "How devotedly I, in my mind's eye, followed the movements of the ship that contained the favorite son of my beloved departed husband." Also proving that Eliza would mention Alexander at any time she had a chance. During his months in Europe, James met Jerome Bonaparte, Napoleon's younger brother, who had abandoned his American wife to wed the princess that his brother had selected for him. James also visited the Vatican Library, where he perused ancient copies of Cicero and the Bible and viewed King Henry VIII's defense of Catholicism. He also had a chance to read two letters that Henry VIII wrote to Anne Boleyn, which James observed were quite absurd love letters in French. Commenting on the corruption of the Italian government, James wrote, "I have met with nothing that has equaled my appreciation of my own country, its government, and people." This particular trip concluded with a journey to Scotland, where James visited the grange for which his father's house had been named, and it was owned by his grandfather. It had been owned by his grandfather, James Hamilton, for whom James was named. There, James met a distant cousin, also named Alexander Hamilton, and discovered an appreciation for Scotch whiskey. When James traveled to Russia in 1841, it was at the request of his son-in-law, George Lee Schuyler, who was delivering a ship to the Russian government and was concerned about the timely payment for it. James went along to help avoid the corruption and bribes that were sort of an expected part of doing business with the Russian government at that time. James was particularly amused when he was introduced as a former Secretary of State and likely future president. When James returned to Europe in 1847 and 1848, it was during a time of widespread revolution. In Italy, he was sought out by reformers to prepare a report of their demands to present to the Pope, which he did. He was in Vienna when violence broke out, and he saw barricades built outside his rooms in Paris. Also, while in France, he wrote a draft of a new constitution at the request of George Washington Lafayette, the son of Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought alongside his father in the American Revolution. While James was overseas, John Quincy Adams died after collapsing on the floor of the House of Representatives, and the cornerstone was laid for the Washington Monument. It was an era of Western expansion, with land added to the U.S. after the Mexican-American War that would eventually become parts of 8 new states, when Mexico ceded 55% of its territory in 1848 under President Polk. James's final trip to Europe occurred in 1851 and was also at the request of his son-in-law, George Lee Schuyler. Schuyler was one of the owners of a schooner named America that had been invited to participate in the Royal Yacht Squadron Regatta. Therefore, James was part of the crew when the America won and gave its name to the annual race as it's been known since that time, the America's Cup. James met Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and had a chance to visit the Crystal Palace, which became inspiration for New York City's own Crystal Palace just 2 years later. This image here is a young John Quincy Adams. I prefer using that one to the picture of him that's usually used of him looking old and curmudgeonly. And this is before he was that angry all the time, I guess. So I like this picture of him. And since he's another important heir of a founder, just like James, I thought we'd give him a little credit here. During the time James was traveling in Europe, Southern states were outlawing the delivery of mail sent by abolitionist organizations, and a gag rule was put in place in Congress forbidding the discussion of slavery. So you can get an idea of just how polarizing this issue was starting to get, rather than being something that sort of the founders assumed would go away. It was growing more divisive. John Quincy Adams, who was former president serving in the House of Representatives by the time these things were happening, he was one of the very few people willing to boldly challenge the gag rule until it was finally repealed. He not only felt like he didn't have as much to lose, probably, as some other representatives, but also he, like James, was trying to live up to his father's name. James was sometimes questioned about slavery as he traveled in Europe, and at this point he responded that the federal government had no power to change it and that the states reliant on slave labor were unlikely to give it up. And his view of this problem was actually very common at that time, and I'm glad that in his reminiscences he admits that that's how he responded, because he was writing after the Civil War, but still admitted that at that time that was his response, and he invited the people he was talking to offer their solution because he couldn't see one. Obviously, his opinion and that of many Americans changed in these next couple decades to get to a point where we're fighting a civil war over the issue. Martin Van Buren was one of the politicians speaking against abolitionists at this time, deepening a rift in their relationship that probably began when Van Buren didn't support Jackson's appointment of James as the district attorney of Southern New York. It wasn't only this friendship that threatened the Democratic Party's increasingly staunch defense of slavery. There's, like I said, just the tensions worsening and polarization happening there, and the fact that we didn't really have the same political parties we have today, so there wasn't a good balancing of powers there. So tensions worsen, these issues dividing the nation, and James attempts to do things like hold town hall meetings to help his community find common ground. Unfortunately, in 1856, violence broke out in the Senate when James's friend Charles Sumner was attacked and almost killed by a Southern senator in response to Sumner's anti-slavery rhetoric. And then in the following year, the Supreme Court issued its infamous Dred Scott decision, which spurred James and others even more on toward abolitionism. In this case, Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that Black people could not be citizens of the United States and had no inherent rights. So whether they were slaves or ever had been slaves didn't matter, just Black people could not have those rights. And James responded with his own pamphlet of dissent, calling Taney's decision palpable judicial perversion. So by this time, as I already mentioned, John Quincy Adams had died in 1848, and he had been one of the loudest voices among the heirs of the founders in encouraging a better future for the United States, which included more nationwide collaboration on improvements, in addition to abolishing slavery. It was Adams who had defended the men aboard the Amistad and won them their freedom before the Supreme Court. And he also, during his presidency, had encouraged all sorts of different national improvements like roads and canals and education, the sort of thing that today we just take for granted that the federal government does. But at the time, he was just too much ahead of his time. So it was not a popular stance then. And once he died, others, and the Civil War approached, others, including James, found their voices as well. Their fathers had believed that slavery would end, but hadn't found a way to abolish it themselves while maintaining unity between those original 13 states. And the division over slavery continued to polarize through the years, abolitionists growing bold, and Southerners going from referring to slavery as a necessary evil to an absolute good that they were willing to fight a war over. If George Washington had believed that slave owners would just continue to emancipate slaves in their wills, as he had until it slowly faded away, he would have been sorely disappointed to see that Southerners actually did the opposite and became willing to sacrifice everything they had to defend the practice. James referred to the Civil War as the rebellion and called it the most interesting period of his life. He was passionate about the survival of the Union, of course, that his father had helped form, and even offered his services as a soldier at the age of 73. And as we know, he became a staunch abolitionist. So I just have a few quotes that I'd like to share with you to sort of establish his personality and his stance at this time. As a Unionist, and this is one of the things that he would have said as he was holding those town hall meeting type things. Express your solemn conviction that the Union under our Constitution is necessary to the preservation of our liberties and our firm determination that at all hazards it shall be preserved. Sounding very much like the son of Alexander Hamilton there. And this next quote is one of my favorites. This was written to General Winfield Scott. Permit me to ask if a hale man of 73 years of age can be useful in any way that you will command my services. He was very eager to join the Union effort in whatever way he could. And then as an abolitionist, he wrote, as soon as the slave states threw off their allegiance, freed from my own constitutional obligations, I became a most determined abolitionist and prepared by all means in my power to abolish slavery throughout the land. So even in this really bold, strong statement, you see that he mentions constitutional obligations because for him, especially as a lawyer, those state rights had been the issue that he was really stuck on. How do you get rid of slavery while respecting state rights? And so far as he was concerned, when states started seceding, they were giving up their state rights. So James was not put in uniform for the Civil War, but he was asked to join a committee to advise President Abraham Lincoln. James hastened to Washington once again, where he asked the new president if he, quote, intended to give as well as receive blows. At this point, Southern states had already been seceding, and James was disappointed in the lethargic response of the federal government up to that point. He had even offered to fund and lead a unit of volunteers himself, another offer that was not accepted. But Lincoln assured him that he was a man of action and later proved it. James's most significant contribution at this time to the war effort actually ended up being his advice to Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase. Both these men understood that the fiscal well-being of the Union was a vital part of securing victory, and James spent many hours helping Chase strategize the best ways to raise money for the war effort. Chase and James were also both vocal in their belief that the Black people should be not only emancipated, but allowed to serve in the Union forces. James spoke in favor of emancipation, giving a passionate speech at New York City's Cooper Union and writing pamphlets with his brother, John Church Hamilton. One of James's final acts of service to President Lincoln was to provide him with a draft of an Emancipation Proclamation. During and after the Civil War, the U.S. saw an increase in the power of the federal government. Southern legislators, like I've already mentioned, had long fought against any issue, including building of roads or other improvements that crossed state lines, knowing that each step in that direction took the federal government closer to having the power to abolish slavery. With Southern states seceded, the emphasis on state rights was reduced, and different kinds of laws were passed that far exceeded what the federal government had previously been able to accomplish, including homestead acts that encouraged Western settlement in all that new space out west that had been won from Mexico. And as we've seen, the federal government continued along that path. And today, the federal government has many, many powers that it didn't have at this time in the 1860s either. James ends his reminiscences with the end of the war, and unfortunately, he doesn't comment on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln or the disastrous course of Southern Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson. He did, however, leave one last pamphlet that he wrote in 1870, and it is in defense of his father's work as Treasury Secretary and of the U.S. Constitution. His father had been dead at that time for 66 years, but his legacy was left in very attentive hands. And actually, even funnier part of that is that the pamphlet was written in response to writing of Martin Van Buren, who had died, but then his sons published it. So this is just this ongoing battle between Hamilton and Van Buren here. But yeah, one of his last writings was defending his father again. James died at Nevis, his home, on September 24th, 1878. He had been preceded by his wife and his daughter Elizabeth, who had died of cancer during the Civil War. After the war, George Lee Schuyler married his wife's sister, Mary, so he remained James's son-in-law. And he's buried here this is the Hamilton family plot at Sleepy Hollow. George Lee Schuyler is also buried here between the two sisters that he was married to. I'll just kind of pause here a second to point out the large stone kind of off to the left. That is James and Mary. James's name is actually on the opposite side that we can't see from this angle. This flat stone kind of in the front, that is Alexander, James's son Alexander, and his wife Angelica Livingston. Also buried here are the Schuyler grandchildren, so the children of George Lee Schuyler and Elizabeth. They did not have children. They're all here. These kind of two similar stones out toward the front is Louisa Lee Schuyler and Georgina Schuyler. Their brother Philip is just kind of there behind them, where the rest of James and Mary's children and George Lee Schuyler are all in that back line there. If you visited the cemetery there, Sleepy Hollow, you've probably seen all these, as well as Washington Irving, and the only daughter of James that isn't here is Frances. By that time, she's Frances Bowden, so she's in that family plot. And as I mentioned earlier, it's through her three children that James has modern day descendants. James's obituary stated, "Those who knew him will miss an old man's picturesque and rambling reminiscences of society and politics in old times. He had seen President Washington and knew all the mythology of the heroes of the Revolution by heart." I want to thank everyone for coming and listening to my talk. If you're interested in my biography of James, which I'm very excitedly holding on the porch at Nevis in this photo, I actually noticed just a day or two ago that Amazon has it. It's a hardcover book for $7. So as much as I would love to encourage you to order it direct from me, I can't get copies from my publishers that cheap. So feel free to go to Amazon, get a deal, $7 for that right now. And yeah, there, feel free to contact me at my email or my website. And I think at this point we're opening up for questions.
Okay, gosh,
Let
just
me stop sharing my screen here too. Sorry about that.
Samantha, thank you so much. It's so interesting to hear people talk about places where, literally in your backyard, and the Nevis and the Aqueduct and the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery obviously are well known to probably everybody in the area. But maybe not as well known is the history of James and what he had done and the life he had lived, and maybe overshadowed, of course, by his famous father. That's a large presence to deal with. But he certainly seemed like a son who lived up to his father's name in a lot of ways. And the time in which he lived, like you said, that century was incredible, and he was right there, right? He was seeing and commenting on the whole thing. So, gosh, thanks, Ed, for bringing that perspective to us. Very much appreciated. We do have a couple of questions. So here's one. Where on the property, Nevis, was James' daughter's cottage built?
I know on the waterfront, but I don't know. I would have to look at an old map to be more specific than that. Sorry.
Okay. Didn't stand the test of time, I guess, that cottage. I don't
Yeah, I
think.
guess not. I don't know how long it was there.
Yeah, okay. Uh, Another question. Were James and Washington Irving actually close friends or just social contemporaries?
Know if they were close friends. Obviously they were close enough friends that James's son served. He went with Washington Irving to Spain, so he worked for him. So there was more than just the connection of at one time being lawyers at the same time and becoming sort of neighbors. They did have that connection as well, where Irving took James's son with him to Europe.
Okay. Um, Personal question. Please tell us why. Please tell us more about why you chose James Hamilton as a subject.
So I generally write about people that other people haven't. And when I found James's reminiscences, I found it because I was doing some research on his mother at the time. For my previous book is about women of the American Revolution, and there's a chapter on Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton in that, and I was just kind of in awe of this big book of correspondence and things that he had done that I had no idea about. And I guess, like I said in my intro, I just thought, you know what, this should be a little more accessible. This is a pretty interesting guy. So that's how I ended up writing about him.
And I'm curious. I'm throwing my own question here. And what kind of reaction from the descendants, if any, have you had about your book?
The only one I have corresponded with is Helen Hamilton Spalding, the one who provided me those images. So I haven't received any feedback other than that.
Okay. Did she like the book?
I don't know if she ended up liking the book.
I hope she did.
I
Okay.
hope so. She was encouraging about the writing of it.
All right. Good. What happened to the house after James's death? Did it stay in the family?
It did for a
Yeah.
while,
Yeah.
yes. I don't remember the exact year off the top of my head. There's a little bit about it in the book. It stayed in the family until it was sold to, oh gosh, I should remember. It's a family that bought other historic properties too. But anyway, then it was donated to Columbia
Columbia.
University. I think 1915, I think is when it was donated to Columbia University. I don't remember the exact year. that it was purchased by a non-family member, but it was in the family for a while. Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned this, the Emancipation Proclamation. I thought that was really interesting. Do you know if Lincoln was influenced by or relied upon what James Hamilton had to say about the Emancipation,
I,
his draft?
yeah, I don't know if he was, I mean, influenced by it, possibly. My impression is that Lincoln was pretty, he liked writing his own things. So I'm sure he used his own draft, but maybe he at least read James's.
At least the guy took a shot at it, right?
Right,
And
right, exactly.
I think of the song from the music about it. He was in the room where it happened, so
Yeah,
maybe he was kind of
yeah.
in the room where that happened.
Hmm.
Is there
He
any
was just
truth to this?
quieter about it.
Okay, yeah. Is there any truth to the story that James was involved in stopping the Great Fire of 1835 in New York City?
Yes, and I do have that in the book as well. And I have a blog about it on my website because that's one of my favorite moments that I learned about James. It makes him sound like a Marvel hero or something. Um, so yeah, I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but yes, that is true that he helped fight that
Yeah,
and helped
okay.
set the fire break, deciding what houses to blow up to stop the fire and that kind of stuff. So yeah, very, very exciting.
Okay. Um, Another question about the Nevis property. Did Stanford White do the redesign? Is a
That I
question.
do not know. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Interesting one. Any idea where the family dog is buried?
Oh goodness, somebody has asked me that before, and I think that possibly someone who works at Nevis can take you to that spot, but I have not visited it. And I'm just gonna say this is the challenge of speaking to people who are already like local historians there. I feel like that it's a challenge to stump me. And yeah, you have. I don't know where the dog grave is.
Well, not only do you have somebody trying to stump you, we have an answer to the question that was raised before about Nevis, about who bought it.
Oh,
That was
perfect.
T. Coleman DuPont.
DuPont. Yes, that is the name I was trying to think of, and it
Okay,
just it escaped me
that's all
for a
right.
moment. Yeah,
You're
thank you.
forgiven. You got a lot in your head going on.
I appreciate it.
Okay, I think that pretty much does it for the questions. And thank you. And a couple of questions, not questions, actually comments about how much people enjoy your talk as
Oh,
well. So
wonderful. Thank you.
kudos for that. Okay, we have a couple more things to do before I get to the contest. One is Sarah. We're going to ask you to come back on, please, so you can talk about our next presentation. And again, Samantha, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And as I said, down home. So
Thank
congrats.
you.
Sarah, you there?
All right, here I am. Um, our next program is really very interesting. It will be on March 22nd at 2 p.m. So it's our usual Sunday 2 p.m. slot. The speaker will be Professor Frederica Baer, and the topic is Hessian soldiers in the American Revolution. It's a close look at the role of those soldiers. Were they bloodthirsty villains or victims of authoritarian rulers? Stay tuned.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, now the time for the contest. And again, there's another announcement in between the contest and the answer to the contest. And I think that whoever wrote that answer to DuPont's probably going to think this is too easy. But any event, so this is an answer with a name. You're gonna have to answer with a name, a well-known name, I think, for hopefully some people. What farmer, son of a sea pilot, settled in Phillipsburg Manor in 1708? He lived near what is today the southeast corner of Broadway and Harriman, and he left 240 descendants when he died. So you can throw your answer on the chat button. And board members, again, feel free, but you will be excused from the award, the unique award. So now's the time where we get to call, make a little pitch donation wise. We as a board decided at our recent meeting that we're going to make a suggested donation request from with our presentations. Typically, we just kind of throw it out there, make a donation, but we're looking if a special favor if you could give us $10 as a suggested donation for today's presentation, just to help us make sure we can continue to give these presentations. Like everybody else, we're suffering from rising costs of everything, and not that the $10 is a whole lot, we hope, but multiplied by a number of people, that obviously will be able to help us in a way that we wouldn't have otherwise. I'd also like to point out that when you do the donate, so you go to the website, the donation button comes right up front and center. You go on there and you'll see that there's also an opportunity to be a monthly donator. Now I'm beginning to sound like NPR here. We love the people who are sustained owners. So we haven't pushed that before. So if that's something, if you could see yourself to donating a couple dollars a month, that obviously would be a great help as well. So here's now the big question. I see we lost we lost a few people. Didn't want to wait around.
Well, you said you were going to ask for money.
Okay, well, the first person has got it. Let's see, we got one, two, three, four, five correct people. And we've got a couple of board members on there, former board member, but Chet, you got beaten to it. Michael, you got beaten to it. In fact, everybody got beaten to it. Paul Gallagher is our winner. It was Johan's Buck Out, who was the answer to that. And Paul, your award is that you get to write the question for the next presentation. So you can email me when you go to the website. I'm the guy that gets the mail. So send along a question you think would be a good one for the group to answer. That would be somewhat accessible, but not necessarily everybody knows. And we'll put that up there the next time. In March 22nd, actually, we'll have that come up. So once again, thanks to everybody for joining us today. May you stay warm. A belated Happy New Year to everybody. And thanks again to Samantha so much for joining us today. Everybody take care. Bye-bye.
You.
Bye-bye. Thank you.